So with February quick on our heels and a handful of amazing JRPGs soon to release, one of those must-play JRPGs of next month is Persona 3 Reload. It's no secret that Persona 3 Reload will be a true and tried remake, one that doesn't change the core story in any way but really just enhances what's already there and gives the player major quality of life changes. And with that, a handful of interviews from devs that really just reinforce those intentions. As with an interview with Takuya Hamaguchi, the game's director, talking about how they decided against making significant changes to the story out of respect for the original game. He says, quote, "We all thought it was an amazing game, and we wanted to remake it, you know. The Persona 3 original experience as it was for a modern audience. As when making a remake, you have to consider who's played the original and who hasn't. When you look at a game like Final Fantasy VII Remake and how they're really trying to go for a fresh experience from the original game, story beats are rearranged or entirely new from what came before. New characters are introduced to us, and even existing characters that didn't show up until later show up very early on in the remake. And while this is not necessarily a bad thing, the fan base has always been split in whether to recommend a new player the remake first or the OG, as the remake is more of a reimagining. So to hear that Persona 3 Reload is following more of a faithful adaptation in its story makes me personally okay with. Give me the original experience, but just better. Of course, when speaking of changes to the game, the producer, Ryota Nitsuma, says, quote, "We were thinking about what would be good to change to the visuals here. And the reason was a lot of people expect a lot from visuals in Persona. And I think personally that our designs are pretty cool. So we know that people are looking for a much lovelier visual experience. And this is great to hear, since with Persona 3 Original and FES, the visuals, while they haven't aged poorly, they don't look the best naturally, as now it's an 18-year-old game. Still though, Persona 3 has a lot of style that has never gotten old. With any remake, I think it's very important to keep the feel, especially in its art style. And when looking at both side by side, you can really tell that not only did they retain Persona 3 style, they amped it up even more. Everything looks a lot more vibrant than the original, which probably comes from the influence of Persona 5. They then go on to ask Yamaguchi, "You talked a little about how you had these two goals. I'm really curious to hear a little more about how that balancing act was like for you guys. What were the biggest elements where you were like, oh, do we keep that? Do we take it out? How do we make this fit for both old and new users?" Yamaguchi then answers, quote, "So I think that's really hard, as you can imagine. As I said, one of the goals was to make a game the original users can enjoy. Probably the easiest way to do that would just be to make a game with no changes whatsoever. But if we did that, then we would have this problem where it doesn't feel like a modern game, and new users who were coming in wouldn't be able to enjoy it, and they wouldn't be able to get the full value of the game. As I said before, the challenge then became like, okay, what do we change and why? And maybe approach these challenges with trying to look through each of these changes that we want to make sure the challenge is clear. It's not really about deciding what to change, it's about just spending so much energy into looking into taking on the challenging spirit to make change. So that was a really hard thing to balance as well. But jumping in and trying to find the spirit to make change, and that was the difficult thing to balance. And I totally understand what they're saying. Again, with remakes, it's always a challenge to gauge what needs to be kept and what should be cut, as to make sure that the game is modernized in a way that can please both old and new fans alike. To make sure that certain scenes with very outdated jokes that they thought were funny back then are either cut entirely or redone in a way as to not offend or weird people out. To also find the courage to make changes to what's already such a beloved game can be daunting, and a lot harder than people tend to realize, as not only do you have to worry about changes to the game, but the soundtrack that Persona is especially known for. Of course, with any new Persona game comes its stylish soundtrack. Yamaguchi goes on to say that several new tracks have been added to Persona 3 Reload. The composer Atsushi Kitajo says, quote, to make music that reinforces the themes of the game. And to do that, not only did they have to create new music, but also hire new voices to fit the feel and tone of this remake. Kitajo also adds on to that, saying, quote, we think the original songs from Persona 3 were amazing, so we wanted to leave those as this is the original, and these are the new vibes we are going for. We wanted to respect the original while trying to create something new. And of course, this is all good news. As someone who lives and breathes this game's soundtrack, everything I've heard so far has just been peak on peak, and I'm definitely excited to hear what other tracks have been added in comparison to the original. Things like Tartarus were also given a big overhaul in how traversing this dungeon will go, with Yamaguchi saying, quote, reworking Tartarus was a top priority for us. However, Tartarus is really tied closely to the story of the game itself. We couldn't make any fundamental changes to the actual dungeon. I think the accumulation of all these tweaks and adjustments overall made major changes to the dungeon and made it a lot more entertaining and fun, and a lot less repetitive to play. It's something I, and I'm sure many others, are really glad to hear, even if it was obvious, as Tartarus was definitely one of the weak points of the game, and even dreadful at times, at least in my opinion. Things like breakable objects, moving your camera in any way you want, and even more party banter, like something you would see in mementos of Persona 5. The culmination of all that and more is releasing in just a week from now, with all the improvements taken into consideration as a result of direct fan feedback. Persona 3 Reload seems to be shaping up to be one hell of a remake, and probably one of the best games of the year. However, Atlus isn't slowing down neither, as not only do we have Persona 3 Reload releasing in 2024, but now with their new IP titled Metaphor releasing later in 2024, being directed by Katsura Hashino, director of Persona 3, 4, and 5. Metaphor is really looking like another hit by Atlus, as it already has so much going for it. Set in a more fantasy-like setting than you would normally see in a Persona game. Something more akin to Final Fantasy or Nier, which I'm personally excited to see. But whether Persona 3 Reload can stick the landing with fans first, however, is something we will have to see come February 2nd, 2024.